Let's play a theoretical game for a moment. Imagine I handed you a book. Upon reading this book, you discover that the author had outlined specific radical policies they were planning on enacting as President of the United States. He wanted to do things like invade Canada to have more living space for the American people. He also wanted to do things like displace ethnic and religious minorities and essentially recreate the federal government from scratch. What would you say the likelihood of this person achieving their goal actually is? Maybe 1% if they're lucky, but probably less. Well, what would happen to that percentage number if I also told you that the person that wrote this book was in federal prison for treason? Sounds like a serious long shot now, doesn't it? What's this guy gonna do? Break out of prison, start his own political party, and run for office, and then use his newfound power to implement these radical ideas of his? Now, I know what you must be thinking. Eric, that's definitely not possible and could never happen in a civilized society like ours. Allow me to say it is, in fact, possible. Because this has happened before. This is essentially what Adolf Hitler did in Germany during the 1920s. Granted, it is very unlikely to happen again today. It is still possible. Now, I want to be perfectly clear with what this episode is. It's an honest attempt to understand the psychology and motivating factors that drove a homeless painter to become the Führer of the German Reich. Regardless of how you feel about him, this was, without a doubt, one of the most formidable men to have ever lived. Imagine how much self-discipline doing something like that takes. The same thing can be said of someone like Joseph Stalin. These are two men who are commonly cited as the most evil people in history. But one thing no one can deny is their sheer individual willpower. Sometimes you have to take a step back and imagine the possibilities had these guys put that same effort towards something more constructive. What if Hitler had put the same amount of effort into his artwork as he did seizing power in Germany? Or had Stalin used his intelligence to build a humane society instead of slaughtering kulaks? I personally believe the question of wasted potential is one that creates the grandest what-ifs in history. There really is no way we'll ever know for sure. And to bring a little context to Hitler's plight, we can compare him to a modern figure, Donald Trump. Not that I'm saying that Trump is literally Hitler or anything like that. This isn't the usual Trump-Hitler comparison you guys are used to. But in terms of sheer willpower, the comparison sheds a lot of light on both of these men. Trump, the son of a wealthy New York City businessman, became the President of the United States, as you all know. A lot of Trump supporters glorify this achievement, and with all due respect, it is remarkable. He was a political outsider and didn't need to rely on corporate interests to fund his campaign. The notion of anyone can be president if they try hard enough finally came true when he was elected. It most certainly was impressive, but imagine how much more impressive it would have been had Trump started out homeless and roaming around the streets of New York City up until his early 20s, and went from a beggar in the streets to calling the shots in the White House. It's a lot more impressive that way, isn't it? Now, something else I want to be really clear on is the purpose of this podcast episode. Now, I do my best to get a really accurate understanding of what motivated whatever person I'm covering, what brought them pleasure, what made them happy. I think most people oversimplify historical figures that they don't like, right? So simply calling Hitler a tyrant and dismissing him, it just doesn't do it for me. He was a human being, and human beings are more complex than that. If you really do believe Hitler was evil, you absolutely need to understand what motivated him. How on earth would you ever prevent the next Hitler if you don't even understand the first? This idea that we're just going to magically know which politicians turn out to be the bad ones is not only foolish, but it's a dangerous idea. It takes a deeply informed opinion to be able to spot these kinds of people out. Because after all, Hitler was very popular. let's not forget there were a lot of Germans, as well as other Europeans, praising him as a great leader. The inconvenient truth of the matter is that Adolf Hitler was an extraordinarily popular figure across Europe. You either loved him or you hated him, and we only focus on those who hate him. But there are quite a few people who, by any other standard, were very decent people, liked and appreciated and admired the man who would eventually call himself Der Führer. Everyone knows about Neville Chamberlain's sympathies, but what about someone who isn't talked about as much, like Carl Gustav Manaheim, a high-ranking Finnish military leader and eventual president of Finland? He ended up being a very good friend to Hitler, not to mention the Irish Republican Army that sought to liberate Northern Ireland from British rule, Indian separatists who were also tired of being occupied by Great Britain, the Shah of Iran, and then even a shared camaraderie with countries like Spain, Switzerland, Sweden. Hitler also maintained friendships with people like Gandhi and Henry Ford. Now, I think historians have tried too hard to oversimplify history into a good versus evil narrative, when in reality, there's a lot more gray than anyone wants to admit. And something I really want to do here is take this person who many think of as a comic book supervillain and show how he was a human being just like you or me. And here's something I'd really like to encourage you to do. The next time you have someone that commits some terrible atrocity or a genocide or a terror attack, I want you to first ask, what on earth happened to this person that could make them do that? I'm a very firm believer that happy people do not commit these crazy crimes or atrocities. Happy, healthy, normal people, they just don't have it in them. Whether it's a chemical imbalance in their brain from birth or maybe an exceptional amount of human suffering. Once the world puts you through enough, you will break. And oftentimes, you will pay the world back tenfold. Take a look at any serial killer or genocidal dictator, and you will find an amount of human suffering that would drive almost anyone to madness. Now, of course, that doesn't excuse these criminals for what it is that they did, but if you're going to be honest about something like this, the trauma these people suffer through needs to be taken into consideration. It is very specifically important to factor in the trauma Adolf Hitler endured in his early life for a couple of reasons. Reasons that I hope will become apparent as the show progresses. But that's going to be enough of that. I think this is the longest introduction for Biocast to date, but without any further ado, the life of Adolf Hitler. I'd really appreciate it if you would go ahead and follow me on Twitter. I know podcasting has a tendency to be very much a one-way conversation, but it doesn't have to be that way. Send me a tweet, let me know what you think. I'm always open to new ideas, and I'd love to get any feedback that you have. So that is twitter.com/Eric Alden. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the show. I tend to begin this part of the episode with the birth of whoever it is that I'm covering. However, I think it would do this particular case justice to begin with Hitler's parents, especially his father. Now, Hitler's father was Alois Hitler. And the bad childhood Alois struggled with changed the way he fathered Adolf Hitler in a very significant way. For one, Alois left home at a very young age to go make something of himself. At the ripe young age of 13, he left the comfort of his family to travel to Vienna in hopes of learning a useful skill or trade, something his son would eventually try to emulate. Alois's life is also important for the story because he didn't know who his own father had been, something that would be a controversial topic, many claiming Hitler's true grandfather was Jewish. Being raised in a broken home was horrible for Alois. Not knowing your biological parents can be very trying on young children. If your goal is to create a bunch of dysfunctional and psychologically damaged people, go have a bunch of illegitimate children, because by the time they're adults, there's a very high chance They are seriously broken and damaged people. It's hard financially, but it also hurts you long term in other ways. When you don't see how a good husband and father is supposed to act, you just don't learn. Many people from illegitimate homes, they just don't know how to behave in a healthy marriage, and they tend to recreate the environment they were raised in. Alois had a number of relationships with women over the course of his life. None of these relationships can quite be described as functional. Before Alois ever fathers Hitler, he's already been involved with multiple women with many illegitimate children. By the time he makes it to who would become Hitler's mother, he had already been through 2 marriages, one of those relationships with a 19-year-old, while he was 43. You wouldn't be out of line if you called him a womanizer, maybe even a misogynist. It's very clear through his actions that he viewed women as disposable, something I think we can all agree is not a good thing. Alois also took himself very seriously. Now, he went from this traveling to Vienna as a 13-year-old to eventually working for the government, and that really made his ego really big as an adult. He always wore his uniform that was issued by the government and insisted others call him Herr Oberoffizial Hitler, translating to something like Mr. Upper Official Hitler. You can really get a sense for how seriously he took himself if you just do a quick Google image search for a picture of him. There are only a few that you can find that are actually of Alois, and I don't think he's smiling in any of them. In 1876, he hired a 16-year-old Clara Pölzl as a household servant. Some of you may recognize that name because that's the name of Adolf Hitler's mother. Of course, it isn't long before Clara Pölzl, the household servant, becomes Clara Hitler, wife of Alois. Their marriage together was relatively successful, at least in comparison with Alois's other relationships, but that didn't mean tragedy wasn't a big part of their lives. The first 3 children they produced together all died very quickly after they were born, and that is something few people can relate to. It's one of the worst things that can happen to you. Think about it. If your significant other dies, they have a word for that. A widow or a widower. If your parents die, they have a word for that. You're an orphan. There is no word for someone who loses a child. They say when a parent dies, a child feels his own mortality. But when a child dies, it's immortality that a parent loses. And after the deaths of 3 of your children, how does that affect the way you treat the 4th? That all lays the groundwork for where we need to be before the birth of the man who will go on to create the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, the 4th child between Alois and Clara Hitler. Some speculate that he was babied by Clara. There certainly was a stronger bond with Clara than Alois, because Alois already had children of his own. This was the first time Clara had children of her own that actually survived past infancy. The problem with covering Hitler's early life is that there's not a lot of information available. There's a bit mentioned in Mein Kampf, but that's according to Adolf himself. Oftentimes a person's view of their own upbringing is a bit skewed. For example, Hitler kind of glorifies his father a lot more than was right to do. This was a man who was an absolute womanizer and beat his children. Trying to frame him as a working man's ideal is a bit disingenuous, and let's just be honest, he really only did it for political reasons. Adolf Hitler's first big struggle in life was with his father. You see, Adolf wanted to become a painter, but Alois wanted his son to become a government official, just like his dad. They were both extremely stubborn men. And a good way to visualize it when you have 2 stubborn people like this is it's a mental battle of tug-of-war. And as often happens in these kinds of situations, the rope breaks. Their relationship suffered. Adolf eventually went on to purposely fail school just to spite his father. The battle was on, but little did Adolf know his father would die before they could ever come to grips with each other. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Adolf made it his life's mission to fight his father on becoming a painter or a public official, something that ruined their relationship and drastically affected his life. And he ended up becoming a public official after all anyway. Weird how things work out that way. However, despite trying to fail school, Hitler did run across a teacher who he claims changed his life significantly. Hitler actually wrote about this man quite a bit. He said that he really pushed on a whole bunch of ideas and knew how to teach the meaning of history. And there's this idea of retaining the essential and forgetting the non-essential that really came from this teacher, and that was kind of the basis for how Hitler thought and educated himself on not only history but other things as well. This history teacher was Dr. Leopold Pulsch. I'm going to apologize for the mispronunciation. I'm sure I butchered that name, and I'm sure I will butcher other names in the rest of this episode, so you'll just have to excuse me. But according to Hitler, this man kept the attention of the class and really got the students to understand the meanings of history. It's an interesting thing to note. He later visited this man years later, in 1938, so long after Hitler becomes the Führer and all this crazy stuff happens. He spends more than an hour alone with Dr. Putsch. When he left the room, he looked to his entourage and said, quote, "You cannot imagine how much I owed that man." End quote. Suffice to say, history was a crucial factor in Hitler's life, especially when he eventually becomes an adult, because it influences him very heavily. Most of Hitler's childhood is filled with suffering. His father dies, he's failing in school, didn't really seem to have much of a future going for him. But it isn't all bleak here, because not too much time passes before Hitler makes his first friend, someone who would be one of the closest people in young Adolf's life. This boy was another young Austrian German by the name August Gustl Kubizek. I'm going to refer to this friend as Gustl because that's what Adolf called him. You see, the two of them were very close. In fact, they were both of the opinion that fate decided they'd be friends. They met as they were trying to get a spot to watch an opera at the local theater in 1904, and the thing that brought them together was a shared common interest in the artistic lifestyle. It wasn't long before they hit it off, and the two were inseparable. Gustl eventually wrote a book about his relationship with Hitler. The book was called The Young Hitler I Knew. He wrote it in 1955, so a good time after the war, and as I'm sure most of you probably know, there was a lot of personal risk in writing something that can be deemed as positive about Hitler after the war. But he went ahead, did it anyway. In the epilogue, Gustl wrote, quote, "Even though I, a fundamentally unpolitical individual, had always kept aloof from the political events of the period which ended forever in 1945, nevertheless, no power on earth could compel me to deny my friendship with Adolf Hitler." End quote. So, despite the serious personal risk, he went ahead and stood by his guns. And I'm especially glad he did because it helps get an accurate picture of Adolf's genuine personality. Gustl talks about Hitler's obsession with arguing. He'd take these minor political issues and something that none of us would argue about, like collections being taken for a charity lottery. I couldn't imagine many people giving much of a thought to something like that, but hey, that's Hitler for you, I guess. One really interesting character flaw this young Adolf has is the way he reacts to opposition or disagreement. Gustl writes, quote, "Adolf was exceedingly violent and high-strung. Quite trivial things, such as a few thoughtless words, could produce in him outbursts of temper which I thought were quite out of proportion to the significance of the matter." End quote. So he's kind of one of those guys that is very easily provoked. You can make him mad with just a few thoughtless words. But it is important to know that Gustav said that he never worried their relationship was in jeopardy. Now, that may have been because he was especially close with Hitler. Did this same understanding go between Hitler and other people he knew and argued with? He doesn't really talk about that, but it could have. Who really knows? As the next few years went by, he gradually became more and more political. His mind was occupied less with art and architecture and more with things like the destiny of the German nation. Gustav wrote about this change in his friend. Quote, "I had been convinced that my friend wanted to become an artist, a painter, or perhaps an architect. Now, this was no longer the case. Now, he aspired to something higher, which I could not yet fully grasp. It rather surprised me, as I thought that the vocation of the artist was, for him, the highest, most desirable goal. But now, he was talking of a mandate which, one day, he would receive from the people, to lead them out of servitude to the heights of freedom. It was an unknown youth who spoke to me in that strange hour. He spoke of a special mission which one day would be entrusted to him, and I, his only listener, could hardly understand what he meant. Many years had to pass before I realized the significance of this enraptured hour for my friend." End quote. It wasn't long after such a proclamation that Hitler disappeared from Gustav's life, traveling to Vienna to change the world forever. There are not many definitive things we can say about Hitler's time in Vienna. We know a little bit from Mein Kampf, where he basically said it was a period of great suffering. Years later, he even spoke about not being able to appreciate the beauty of the city because he associated it with those hard times. There is something interesting to note. Now, there's a great memoir I came across while researching this Biocast episode. The memoir is by Ernst Hunshdangle, who was a half-American, half-German National Socialist. He eventually rebelled against Hitler and defected to the United States, where he worked for FDR. He had a really interesting passage where he was talking about the Nazis seizing official documents from the government of Vienna. His suspicion was that Hitler had been arrested or committed some kind of crime during the hard times and didn't want anyone to find out about it. Of course, there's no way we're ever going to know for sure, but I personally thought that was really interesting. Hitler left the Austrian city of Linz in 1907. He was determined to make an artist out of himself, however his thoughts were really occupied with politics. Throughout the rest of his life, he still drew pictures and was always doodling whenever he had a free moment. He applied to the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna, which was one of the most prestigious art schools in the world and still is to this very day. As many of you will know, Hitler was rejected. Now, despite popular belief, it was not because his artwork was bad. For one, that's very subjective. You can make an argument that this or that artwork is bad, especially a lot of people who graduated made that modernist type of art. There are a lot of people who don't even consider that stuff art, and to be honest, you can't really blame them. The guy who made the call told Hitler that his skills were in architecture, and he encouraged him to go do that, and not waste his time becoming a painter. Well, the problem was, he needed certain schooling to become an architect. Seeing as Hitler didn't have the necessary qualifications, this basically left him screwed. But he was still determined to become an artist. He made watercolor paintings, postcards, and random sketches to sell. This was never very much money, certainly not enough to live on, so he was homeless for a few years. He made his way as a day laborer for a while, but things just weren't working out. The big change came when World War I broke out. Adolf Hitler had been drafted into the Austro-Hungarian military, where he didn't really want to serve, and he ended up failing the qualification test. He was deemed not physically fit enough. Instead, he ended up volunteering to fight in a Bavarian unit. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that he should not have been allowed to enlist in Germany. He was, after all, an Austrian citizen, But as will happen a few times in Hitler's life, the authorities kind of turned a blind eye to the fact that they were letting a foreign national into the Bavarian infantry. Despite all the bad things you can say about this man, you cannot call him a coward. Upon enlisting, he volunteered to be a runner in no man's land, a place that understandably had a very high mortality rate. He would attack men who were being pessimistic about the war efforts. He didn't think they were being patriotic enough. Hitler's commanding officers must have appreciated the gesture because he never got in trouble for assaulting other infantrymen during wartime. One of the most ironic bits in this whole war story is the fact that Hitler never made it past the rank of corporal. He certainly could have been able to, but one of Hitler's superiors said that he, quote, lacked the capacity for leadership, end quote. Interesting. Toward the end of the war, he was blinded and hospitalized. It was in the hospital that he learned that Germany had officially surrendered and that the Kaiser abdicated the throne. Germany was now a republic. Now, one important thing to note was the German military's power during the First World War. Just a few decades prior, there were a bunch of Central European states that all spoke German, many of these states being serious European powers. I mean, just look at Prussia. When all these German states combined to create the German Empire, it was by far the most powerful country in Europe, and individually, maybe the world. World War I was the first time this superpower got a chance to get a road test. Despite winning most battles throughout the Great War, the politicians back home agreed to surrender. Hitler and many other Germans were deeply bothered by this. Not only did Germany surrender in a war it should have won, but it took all the blame for the war to begin with. You already know about the Versailles Treaty and its unfairness, but you have to imagine a staunch, radical nationalist watch all this happen to the country he loved, and then watch France occupy German territory and terrorize German citizens. And when the country couldn't make reparation payments, France just marched right in and took stuff. I can't even imagine how terrible that all must have been to go through as a German citizen, let alone a German nationalist. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, think about if the United States and Mexico got into a war, and for some weird reason, the United States lost because the politicians just kind of agreed to surrender. And then Mexico occupied American territory, and then occasionally would just come in and take stuff. Like, it's just crazy to think about. Now, it's all this animosity that drives Hitler into politics. He experimented with different political ideas and parties and tactics for a while, but things didn't get serious until the Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler and early National Socialist members tried overthrowing the local Bavarian government in Munich. The uprising failed, but it attracted a lot of attention. This is how a number of future party members found out about Hitler and the National Socialist Party, including Joseph Goebbels. The case made Adolf Hitler a national hero and framed him in an interesting narrative, that of a rebellious nationalist fighting for his country against this corrupt government. It's important to note that Bavaria was under communist control for a short time after World War I, officially a Soviet republic. Thanks to the German military, the communist rule was overthrown in 1919, but the damage had been done. The people of Bavaria, and across Germany, now understood the terror of communism. The short-lived regime mimicked many of the tendencies of the USSR: censorship, restriction of freedoms, shortages, and just general chaos. There was eventually a word for it, and you'll have to excuse my pronunciation: Schrecken in Schreckschaft, roughly translated as the rule of horror. This would be a powerful propaganda tool for right-wing people, not in just Bavaria, but all across Germany. Now, what tends to happen when you have a political extreme in power is you have a swing to the other extreme in response. When a left-wing extremist seizes power and people have to live under it, people swing to the right. And that's exactly what happened in Bavaria. The National Socialists were only one of many radical right-wing groups. The vast majority of people in that area were anti-communist, anti-republican, and reactionary. Hitler and his political views were very common for people in that time, in that area. Something I really didn't expect to learn researching this episode was the fact that Hitler's early political ideas really weren't all that extreme. Because in the beginning, there were just a few serious issues to be dealt with. So there was stopping communists from overthrowing the government, repelling the unjust Versailles Treaty, and rebuilding Germany. Originally, that's all him and the Nazis wanted to do. Until 1934, many of the prominent leaders in the party were openly left-leaning. Let's not forget about the socialist side to National Socialism. In fact, if you call yourself a progressive today, you likely have a lot in common with many early Nazis. Anti-smoking, rights for workers, fair and equal pay, animal rights, anti-capitalism. These were all prominent ideas in the early National Socialist Party. The early Nazi Party was actually a very well-balanced. You had people that were really right-wing and you had people that were really left-wing, and they kind of came together and had this common camaraderie that was the National Socialist Party. Now, during the Night of the Long Knives, the left-leaning faction of the party was purged. You can make the argument this purge shifted the politics of the party in a very negative way. The left-leaning faction really balanced things out. Now there was just a bunch of right-wing extremists, and for those wondering, this is where the whole debate about Nazis being left or right-wing comes from. Truth is, they were somewhere in the middle until 1934 at least. After the purge, they were definitely right-wing extremists. Like, you can't argue that. Hitler's personal political ideas also become more extreme as time passes. Hunshdangle writes about losing influence over him to the extremists in the party. People like Rosenberg, Goebbels, and Hess, and these were all people that were a bit nuts in their own right. Like Rosenberg, for example, he was like really where the anti-Semitism came from in the Nazi party, and it's ironic because he was half Jewish. It was these inter-party extremists that pushed an otherwise decent political platform into the radical government that everyone knows about. Racial supremacy, hatred of Jews, and Lebensraum were never supposed to be core tenets of the ideology, but the radicals proved to be influential over Hitler, and that's the route the party took. Now, there's something about Hunshdangle that I can personally admire, right? Because he kind of takes responsibility. He's like, yeah, I was a Nazi party member, but I did defect and work for the US. And there's something in that that can be admired. And one of the themes I really get from his book is this idea that it was a decent party at one time. Like, they weren't just a bunch of nut jobs. It was sane at one point. And eventually they just weren't. Now, as Hitler's influence grew, his head inflated by a lot. You thought the whole Führer thing was bad, which, by the way, is German for leader? According to reputable sources, he even began developing a messiah complex. He thought of himself as the second coming of Christ. Now, in most cases, if someone starts thinking they are the second coming of Christ, it isn't too big a deal. You normally just laugh them off. I mean, you have to be a little off your rocker to genuinely believe something like that. They probably wouldn't hold any real power, and even if they did, they'd lose that power so quickly their heads would spin. It's a whole different can of worms when the person that believes this is the leader of a major political party. There's an account of Hitler one night, which Dietrich Eckart describes, where Hitler is walking up and down a courtyard with a whip, saying things like, quote, "I must enter Berlin like Christ in the Temple of Jerusalem and scourge out the moneylenders," end quote. And other over-the-top, crazy stuff like that all the time. Have you ever wondered where the whole 1,000-year Reich idea came from? Hitler got that idea from the book of Revelation, where it talks about the return of Christ to earth and the 1,000 years of peace that follow. There was even a new version of Christianity invented for the sake of the government. You can think of it as a transition religion. It was called positive Christianity. It was developed by none other than Rosenberg, who staunchly hated Christianity, and it changed a few key tenets of the religion itself. This new positive Christianity denied Christ as the Son of God, and as the Minister of Church Affairs explained, quote, "The Führer is the herald of a new revelation," end quote. One of the major goals of this positive Christianity was the expulsion of foreign Christian religions and the replacement of the Bible with Mein Kampf and the cross with the swastika. That should give you an idea of how insane Hitler's ego eventually becomes. And a really interesting resource I used for this episode was actually a document created by the US government. It's called The Analysis of the Personality of Adolf Hitler. They basically do a psychological analysis of him and sum it all up. It's a really interesting read, and I strongly encourage you to check it out yourself. You can get it for free online. But one of the major ideas in it was that Hitler's ideology was all based on things he himself personally lacked. For example, pure German blood was highly praised. Hitler's family comes from illiterate peasant stock and had Jewish family members from his godfather and likely his grandfather. Fertility was an important aspect to civilization, at least according to the Nazis. Hitler himself was probably incapable of having children. Admiration of brute strength was also important, and Hitler was never someone you'd think of as physically fierce, especially because he failed the test to get into the Austrian infantry. The report argues all of this and more led to Hitler having an insane, almost inhuman craving for power. Considering how things went, I'd say they were right on the money. So Hitler's ideology, at least according to this report, and I think there's a lot of merit to this report, was that his ideology was strongly influenced by things he just personally lacked in. Having kids, being strong, being from pure blood. All of the enemies that the Nazis made, right? When you make these kinds of criticisms and make it your identity, your political ideology, it's almost like projection in a weird way. The fact that someone with a Jewish godfather is a rampant anti-Semite it's just a bit odd. And I think it's very similar with Rosenberg, who was half Jewish and the most anti-Semitic guy in the Nazi party. It's like the same thing going on there. Now, an event from Hitler's personal life that is very telling of what happened is with his niece, Angela Robel. She was technically only Hitler's half-niece, but they were very close nonetheless. They got really close around 1925 or so right around the time Hitler's political career is getting off the ground. He began taking care of her, and the two got along great. But as years passed, Angela allegedly did something that would end the relationship forever, and not long after that, she mysteriously committed suicide. Her body was found in Hitler's Munich apartment. She died of a gunshot wound to the lung, and the handgun that was used to kill her was Hitler's own pistol. Hitler's political opponents went wild with speculations as to what exactly caused this, some saying she was abused by Hitler, others saying that she was assassinated. The most likely reason, in my humble opinion, is that she was quietly encouraged to commit suicide by Hitler himself. That actually became a common tactic of the Nazis when someone became an inconvenience. They left you alone in a room with a gun and basically told you to kill yourself, but not outright. That leaves you wondering though, why would Hitler do that to his own family member? Well, after the war, Angela's mother was interviewed. She claimed that Angela was trying to marry a man from Linz, a relationship that Hitler did not approve of. She really couldn't do anything about it, seeing as Hitler pretty much had complete control of her life. Hunshdangle claims in his memoir that Angela was pregnant by a man in Linz, and even worse, this man was a Jewish art teacher. So in all honesty, I could totally see this as being very plausible. Now, if this theory is true, that Hitler just kind of left her alone with a pistol, hoping she'd kill herself because she was never going to marry a man of Jewish origin with his permission, it really says a lot about Hitler as a person. I'm not sure I entirely believe it. I think it's very plausible, but it's a very interesting theory to consider. Something that is one of the greatest travesties of the whole situation is the fact that, economically, Hitler was a genius. World War I left Germany dead broke, in debt that it couldn't pay, and millions dead. Hitler took that same country and not only helped it survive the global depression of the 1930s, but also made it the economic powerhouse of Western Europe, creating at least 5 million jobs in the process, and on top of that, making Germany the strongest individual country during World War II. If you take Nazi Germany and put it up against any single Allied nation without outside help, Germany probably wins. Even the USSR was only able to fight back after it received funding from the Westerners, namely the US and Great Britain. You take away Western funding from Soviet Russia, and Germany wipes the floor within a year. Because remember, the USSR, left to its own devices, could hardly beat Finland, a tiny country with a population under 10 million. Now, you might be wondering, how did Hitler structure this economy that made Germany a serious player? There were a few things, but the oversimplified version for the sake of this podcast really had to do with building infrastructure like the Autobahn, among other projects, privatizing sectors of the economy in a more free market sense. It strongly encouraged entrepreneurship, and most importantly, he issued a debt-free currency. I'm not going to get too into the economics of the whole thing because that does get a little bit boring, but suffice to know, if you need an example of socialism producing an economically solvent country, this is it. It's probably assumed that I'm going to be discussing World War II at some point, right? Well, I can't imagine anyone listening to this that doesn't already have a decent idea of what happened, right? So you had Germany expanding its territory into places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, taking over Austria and merging and becoming one country. Everyone knows all this. Instead, I'm going to focus on some of the aspects of World War II that you have hopefully not heard anything about. And as someone who is obsessed with history and thought they knew something about World War II, a lot of this information was new to me. So hopefully it is for you as well. Now, in the late 1930s, everyone was afraid of communism. They saw what happened to the Russian people, where they were slaughtered, and things like the Holodomor, where as many as 12 million Ukrainians died from starvation, and people thought to themselves, I really don't want that to happen in my country. Unfortunately for many of those countries, the USSR was heavily working toward implementing world communism. It did this and that in foreign nations, but it's understandable that they would also try and turn neighboring countries into communist blocs as well, right? So the USSR, it just wanted more communists because they would automatically be allies. One of the countries it really wanted was Finland, especially because it's close enough that it could just be absorbed into the larger USSR, and then more territory, more people under communism, it would just spread easier. So it was a no-brainer. What most people don't realize is the reason Hitler felt bold enough to go to war with the USSR was because of how difficult it was to conquer Finland. The USSR got its face punched in. Finland fought ferociously in the Winter War of 1939 and 1940. Just to get some numbers in there for perspective, the highest estimate of death from Finland is about 25,000. Compare that to the Red Army's roughly 150,000 dead or missing. Hitler took note of this and began planning Operation Barbarossa. He's alleged to have said of the Soviet Union, quote, You only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. End quote. It's really easy to see how someone like Hitler got the idea that Germany could beat the USSR because the USSR could barely beat Finland. An interesting aspect of the Eastern Front was the relationship between Germany and Finland. Carl Gustav Manaheim, who I mentioned earlier, was a wildly crucial figure on the Eastern Front during World War II because he fought alongside the Nazis who came up to and occupied Finland. So imagine Nazis coming to your country and occupying your territory, and you only have good things to say about them. That's really weird, isn't it? Unfortunately for Finland, the war turned against their favor and the USSR gained the upper hand. At a certain point, the Finnish government was forced to expel any German military presence. It was either that or have their economy and people absolutely decimated. But before President Karl Mannerheim did that, he wrote a personal letter to Hitler with great hesitance. He even goes on to praise the German Wehrmacht, the people who had been occupying Finland for years during World War II. Mannerheim actually goes on to say, quote, "The Germans in Finland were certainly not the representatives of foreign despotism, but helpers and brothers in arms. But even in such cases, foreigners are in difficult positions requiring such tact. I can assure you that during the past years, nothing whatsoever happened that could have induced us to consider the German troops intruders or oppressors." End quote. That really paints a different picture from what we're used to hearing, doesn't it? But once it became apparent that Germany was not going to win the war, Adolf Hitler committed suicide. Shortly before he did, he married Eva Braun, who had been kind of his mistress throughout the war. Adolf Hitler's life provides a lot of lessons, and with the death of Adolf Hitler and the end of the Nazi dictatorship, Germany has actually seen a lot of improvements. They learned their lesson, and it's something of an inspiration. Today, Germany is one of the most powerful countries in the world. Economically, and even militarily, it still ranks in the top 10. So we should be able to look back at the life of Adolf Hitler and take some lessons away. Lessons that are not specific to Germany, but ideas and ideologies that can be spread to anyone at any time. Everyone agrees that it's important to learn from history, and it's also important that we learn the right history, the accurate history. We need to get a real picture of what took place, and I think this take on Hitler's life really provides that. It really shows how not only neglect of a child can create terrible atrocities and horrible things for the world, but also how destroying and attacking a country can create a reaction that can be terrible. Another thing I'd like to discuss is the position the United States was in during the war, and how impossible it was to make a good decision. In all honesty, it was not our war to fight, but if the US didn't get involved, there was a chance there'd be an invasion we could not stop by ourselves. As we now know, the world was basically split into two after the war, and it was divided between communism and capitalism. But what would it have looked like had the United States sided with the Axis powers? There were a bunch of Americans who thought this was in our best interest, but there was always the fear that somewhere down the road, Lebensraum, or living space for the German people, was not going to stop at Europe, but was going to be America too. So we decided with the communists. Of course, the USSR tried 1,000,001 tactics to overthrow the US government, resulting in the Red Scare, and then there's the rest of the Cold War, which was one international dumpster fire. So did the United States make the best decision? Strategically, I'd say yes. Unfortunately, this allowed communism to grow and expand from as far as Eastern and in some parts Western Europe to across the rest of the world, especially in places like Asia and Latin America. Would these places have been better off had it been the Nazis who we sided with and they eventually expanded their ideology to all these other places? It's hard to say, and really, who knows? Hey everyone, Eric Alden here. I just wanted to have a brief update and kind of let you know what's been going on. I've been struggling to figure out a decent schedule for Biocast, and I'm pretty set on one show a month. So be sure to subscribe and you will be able to get access to all the new episodes when they come out. Now, I've also been working on Dark History, which is a massive project. There are 3 arms to Dark History. One is the blog, which can be found at darkhistory.blog, which also kind of acts as the main website. The other is the YouTube channel, where there's going to be a whole bunch of videos and documentaries and stuff like that. And then there is the podcast. Our mission is to bring interesting stories from history to the internet in a modern way and make it really enjoyable. We do not run any ads on any of our content, which always makes it better. So you can find links to all of that in the show notes, and I'd strongly encourage you to check it out. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys in the next one.